Yeah, but let's get started, and then people can join as they catch up with us. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and welcome to some new faces, and good to see some existing customers here as well. Hopefully, we can all learn something and give you a good update in terms of where we are with AgriSound and the exciting things we've got in store. We've got Casey Woodward here, founder and the CEO, and Callum Phoebe, who's the lead technical and customer support manager for the business. We're going to talk you through kind of a bit about us, history, and then go into more detail in terms of the applications of the device, how it's working out there in the real world, how it's creating value for clients. And then we'll go into a deeper dive on the device itself, the dashboard, the reports, how they operate, and a few case studies at the end. It's an open forum to ask questions, so please put them in the chat and we'll get to them when we can. And we'll also have a few polls going through the session. And so if you can all keep an eye on those and respond, that will be great. In terms of the quick headlines, there's kind of two core products in terms of what we do: precision pollination and biodiversity monitoring. We'll tell you more about those over the next 45 minutes. And we've also got a pilot offer at the moment, which is designed for customers to be able to get familiar with a small number of devices over a concise period of time, 3 months, and then see the devices in operation, and then be able to scale up to longer term monitoring, which is where you really see the value of the data. We'll be following up with a questionnaire after this, and welcome the chance to talk you all through that individually when diaries allow. But I'm just going to put the first poll in now. Hopefully this is going to work. If you can't see it, then if you just click down to the activities tab on the bottom right, then it should materialize there. And if everyone can answer when they get a moment, and I'll pass over to Casey to talk you through the business in a bit more detail.
Brilliant, thanks Ian. And firstly, a massive welcome to everyone to the webinar. It's really exciting to see you all here today as well. And for those of you who don't know much about AgriSound, really what the business is all about is kind of what it says on the tin. So we're a company which specializes in smart sound analysis, and we apply that within an agricultural setting to really be able to understand what's going on in terms of biodiversity and pollinator levels. So without kind of boring everyone about our kind of why we're here, the vision and the mission for AgriSound is really looking at how can we use bioacoustics, this really new and emerging form of technology, coupled with AI, to really drive both agricultural productivity and environmental sustainability throughout the global food supply chain. As the business suggests, we're very focused on technology development, but particularly making sure that that's accessible for everyone to deploy, irrespective of number of hectares, the farming system, the land type, or geographies. Next slide, please. So for those of you who signed up via the form, you'll know that we asked a couple of questions at the starting point. And one of the things we really wanted to do was understand why or what you wanted to get out of this. Why is monitoring interesting for you? Now, what we thought was really interesting, perhaps not too surprising, was that people was really interested in learning more today about ways in which they can enhance biodiversity and support habitat sustainability, but also secondly looking at kind of how can that be monitored as well. So hopefully you're all in the right place, and we'll get some value out of today's session. Next slide, please. And again, what we're really pleased to see is we've got a really broad church of attendees today. We've got people from a very technical background. So we've got agronomists and beekeepers, ecologists as well, through to corporate sustainability managers, consultants, project managers, and the research space as well. So we're really great to see we've got a really diverse group of people here today. And one of the things we're really keen to understand is from this session is, what is your willingness like to share data? You know, are you happy to share this data with the broader AgriSound ecosystem or not? And we'll be coming back to that later in the webinar. Next slide, please. Oh, I think we might have just skipped one. Okay. So we're going to hear in more detail about the product, but very simply, the poly unit you can see on the screen there is a single solution, but has multiple benefits. So what this device is doing in a nutshell is listening out for those wing beat frequencies of the pollinators of interest. And we're using that information in a whole range of different ways. We can use that to improve agricultural productivity. So if we can get bees into the right place at the right time, we can use that to improve crop yields and crop productivity. And we're going to share some examples of where that's been done in a soft fruit context later on today. But ultimately, this information can also be used to really start to understand how do those land use changes impact pollinators, and we can use pollinators as an indicator of overarching ecosystem health and biodiversity. So this not only helps us to understand how those land use changes are impacting biodiversity, but also we can start to use this information as a way to then report on that back to the wider stakeholder groups, whether or not that's investors, consumers, other forms of customers as well, and really helping that storytelling piece as well. Next slide, please.
Questions that have come in. I think one's pertinent to this slide around just what the device is actually able to listen to, and how many species can it monitor at once. It's a question we had.
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and I think this product is, fundamentally is a smart listening device. At the moment, it's trained to recognise the sounds of two pollinator groups, honeybees, so the Apis group, and bumblebees, the Bombus group. But that's certainly not to say that as we progress, we'll start to be able to detect more and more species of interest. And I think, again, if there's species of interest which you think are particularly interesting, or there's a strong business case to support investment of, then do please let us know, because we'd be delighted to hear that. In terms of the broader context, I think everyone on this webinar, I'm sure, will be familiar with the challenges that pollinators face at the moment. We know that pollinators play a vital role in the agri-food sector. Somewhere in the region of 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food are dependent on pollinators, but they're really at risk at the moment, and that risk is accelerating at the moment, largely due to climate change, agricultural intensification, and pest and disease pressures. And so some of the information you can see here on the slide just goes to bring that into the mind's eye. So not only is 75% of food crops partially dependent, at least, on pollinators, and we're talking about pollinators broader than just bees here, but also those other beneficial insects, as well as larger pollinators as well. But also, if you can overlay that where we're starting to see, where pesticide use still represents a really significant challenge. And although we're seeing some positive steps in terms of increasing the use of pesticides responsibly in developed markets, clearly that's a challenge broader, as particularly outside of UK and Europe. Next slide, please. So again, this is a slightly busy slide, but just to kind of bring that to life a little bit more, on the right hand side you can see a whole range of different crops which have different levels of dependency on pollinators. The important thing to note is that when we look at from a food perspective and a healthy diet perspective, those crops which have an essential requirement for insect pollination or animal pollination are those which are highest in micronutrient content and vitamin content. So for healthy diets, we certainly need pollinators. There's lots of work that's coming out now linking back poor pollinator activity levels with poor nutrients within food, poor availability of those high nutrient foods, and then linking that back to bad health outcomes as well. And so again, thinking about it from a supply chain resilience and human health population perspective, making sure we can maintain pollinator levels is absolutely vital from a healthy population perspective. So we're going to talk about this in more detail, but just in a nutshell, kind of how do we take this information and how do we deploy these devices to collect some useful information? So First things first is obviously we have to install these devices, and the image of the laptop shows you where devices have been deployed in a particular environment. This is in a series of polytunnels, and we're deploying there to understand what's going on. So we deploy these technologies. These technologies are all able to then share data back to the cloud, and we have a dashboard which you're going to see in a moment, which brings that to life and shows where are those areas of deficit, where are the areas where we need to intervene, where are the areas where we've got perhaps too many pollinators, and we can use that to make data-driven decisions about where we might want to intervene. And so over time, all of this information becomes increasingly valuable, not only to understand how a site's changed, but how those habitats and landscape changes could be deployed across broader areas. What impact might that have? And it can really become a forecasting tool to manage those landscapes better over the longer term. Next slide, please. So I think it's the final slide for me. I mean, we're talking a lot about agriculture today, and certainly that's kind of the area in which we've got lots of examples we can share, but it certainly isn't the only environment we've deployed in. We've got devices, we've got thousands of devices deployed globally, but in a whole range of different landscapes. So everything from different agricultural production environments, from livestock through to broadacre, orchards, polytunnels and controlled environments, but also through to things like solar farms, data centers, the urban environments as well, looking at the impact of green rooftops and green walls. And then we're finally looking at, specifically looking at hive monitoring as well. So can we deploy these devices to monitor bee colony strength? And we're certainly doing lots of work in that space as well. But I'm going to pass over at this point.
Quick question before you go, just someone's popped up with, do the devices work internationally? And are there any limits in terms of where you can deploy them?
Yeah, so absolutely. So at the moment, the devices are, they are deployed globally. We've got them in around a dozen countries. At the moment, there's a requirement to have a mobile cellular connection, so the devices need to be deployed where you can have phone strength. And we've got devices that can operate over low bandwidth, so 2G, and devices which can operate over a 4G or a higher bandwidth frequency range.
Excellent. Thanks, Casey. Just before we hand over to Callum, I just want to make sure everyone's aware that we have some polls going on. You have to click through onto the bottom right where it says activities and then click on polls to be able to engage with them. We've got some interesting responses there, but it's still quite a small response rate compared to the number of people we've got on the call, which is fantastic. So if you have time to go in there and just pop in some answers, that would be great. And don't be shy putting in the questions, please, in the chat. Callum?
Great, thank you. Yes, so this is the poly sensor. We've designed this as part of a kit, which you will get. In that kit, you get the sensor itself, a solar panel, and a tree mount. The tree mount is using a similar connection as a GoPro fixture. So like the applications Casey's just shared above, the sensor can fit into a range of environments seamlessly. We focused on building this kit so we can make sure the sensor is as versatile as possible. It's lightweight, very small, compact, and get it in the right location, and then you can get the power source where that needs to be as well. So the device is built and designed to operate all year round. Configurable recording schedules. So as we mentioned, we've got devices globally. They can be set to record from 4 AM till 10 o'clock at night, or however best fit for that production environment. And no matter where you are, the device will send data to the dashboard on its local schedule. The device not only records the bee activity, but it's recording temperature, humidity, and light levels, so that over time you can understand the insights of these and display that on the dashboard and drill deeper into the insights. Next slide, please. So this is the dashboard. The dashboard is about monitoring trends over time and mapping where these are. So the first thing that you'll see when you log on is a map of your site and where the devices have been installed. Now, quite quickly, you'll be able to see hotspots of activity and where areas are needing more attention. We then start to break down the project with sites, environments, crops, and anything custom to your project. Next slide, please. So on the monitoring system itself, we take you through a registration process before you get the devices to make sure we both understand how the kit's going to be deployed and used. So we come up with the best methodical and strategical deployment plan. So when you scan the device via the QR code, you'll be entering information that then will feed into the platform, providing you good data and quality insights from the get-go. These insights, we then drill down deeper to understand what's going on between each environment. So up on the top right here, we have a breakdown of all the different environments that the devices are looking at in this project. We can then go to another example below here where we're looking at different varieties of a crop. So in this example, it's blueberries. We can see an early variety outperforming the late variety within a few days of the devices being installed. And then the custom bit for the projects is different in every case. The example here at the bottom is trying to understand the different practice types within regenerative and conventional farming. And there's lots of different examples like best and traditional, looking at the difference between cover crops and no cover crops. And the importance of setting up the project in the right way is so that we're collecting continuous data from the get-go and driving the right narrative to be able to drive good data-driven decisions. And this is going to lead on to some case studies where we're then able to create really impactful stories that support your reporting and business decisions on farms.
Just a quick question, Callum, that's come in, as you mentioned, kind of continuous monitoring. The question is just saying, do the devices continually monitor or do they switch on and off for certain time periods? For example, 1 minute in every 5 minutes or something?
Yeah, so when the device boots up, you'll get a green light flash on the LED here. Once that is on a slow green blink, the device is constantly listening out for its bees and it's sending the data on a standard schedule each hour. So each hour we'll get a reading of temperature, humidity and activity, and then that will filter onto the report. On the dashboard, we'll then be able to look back at not only the previous day, week, month and year, that will change the whole reporting quite unnaturally, depending on the filters that you select on the report.
So you can slice it and dice it however you want.
Yeah.
And then just in terms of the sensor, someone's asked, what's the range of each sensor and how do you approach monitoring over large areas?
Yeah, so in a controlled condition where we've been doing our testing, the microphones are listening out within a meter squared radius. And the idea behind that is that it's replicating the same job that someone goes and does in a field with marking out a quadrant. Now, each environment's very different. So acoustics has the sound of sounds has a massive impact on the acoustics. So if you're right next to a train line, then your detection range is going to reduce massively. So different environments, we need to start to understand how they change over time. So that whole first year of monitoring is understanding what that environment's like, what the baseline reading is. So then in the second year or second phase of monitoring, we've got something to compare against.
Casey, you're going to talk through M&S?
Yeah, so just a couple of quick case studies, guys, just to kind of give you a bit of a flavour of kind of the types of projects we're involved in, how they work, and then some of the impact that's been generated from that. So many of you will be familiar with the work we've been doing with Marks and Spencer's. For those of you on the call that are not from the UK, M&S is one of the UK's premium food retailer brands. And we've been working with them over a multi-year period now, looking at how we can deploy devices across a whole range of different farms within their supply chain. And so really the reason that work's been done is to start to understand what is the impact of these land restoration efforts or kind of conservate, the inclusion of conservation habitats within a farming setting, and how does that impact sites which perhaps have more or have less. So the idea is that we've been able to deploy a series of devices across 20 different sites, and we've recorded in total for around 160,000 hours of recordings. And what that's been able, what that's enabled us to do is really to start to compare what does it mean when you kind of farm with nature versus against nature? So when you have inclusion of these habitats or not, and you can see the graph on the left-hand side just shows that actually the importance of having farms, the importance of farming with nature is, can't be understated fundamentally. We see that those cropping areas have a really significant impact on pollinator populations, and that's sustained over time. And when you take those environments away, your pollinator populations are not as strong. But what we also wanted to do was start to understand, based on this data, which conservation habitat types provide the most bang for your buck. So what we was really surprised, actually, we was assuming that wildflowers, which are obviously a very important source of pollen, nectar, and habitat for bumblebees and honeybees, we thought that they would naturally be the place where we see the highest levels, but it wasn't. In fact, we saw highest levels around the water source, but followed by hedgerows. So interesting that actually a diversity of different habitat types is really important for maintaining rich pollinator populations. And some of this information now is being used and being scaled across that supply base to really help farmers in different areas and different geographies to make decisions around how they can strengthen their landscapes for promoting healthy pollinator populations. Next slide, please. And another.
Sorry, Katie, there's a quick question that's come in. You probably take that probably more in relation to M&S broadly, but it's just asking about different species of honeybees and bumblebees. Can the device actually detect those, or is it simply the presence of either of those species?
Yeah. So the AgriSound device is primarily a tool of abundance rather than species richness. So we're monitoring the time metric that's at the time that those sounds are being present for, and we're treating that as the activity measure. This device is not able to go down to species level, so it's looking at the functional group. So we're looking at Apis or Bombus rather than sort of Apis mellifera mellifera or other subspecies groups. So it's a broader tool than other forms of data collection, but provides continuous long-term monitoring in ways which would be difficult to collect through manual observations or eDNA monitoring and things like that.
Great. And then there's another question here around how can this data be used for biodiversity net gain or biodiversity credits?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. And I think we've recently published some materials on the website relating to that exact query. So I encourage anyone to go and have a read through on that when you get a moment. But in a nutshell, the way in which the BNG metric is currently calculated is very formulaic. It's around the use of habitat type and the size of habitats, and that's what's used to create the units that can be monetized. Now, where we see the value of this data is longer term. We see that those metrics evolving to become much more outcomes driven. So actually, we've made this change. What impact is it actually having? And so that's where these tools will really come into their own as a way of kind of unlocking the value of those units. So limited in the short term, but increasingly valuable in the longer term.
And that's definitely a conversation that we're having, a live conversation with a number of clients at the moment. It's around using this data to evidence higher quality of credits over time, and then driving the value from that.
Absolutely.
AB InBev?
So AB InBev is, again, another really interesting case study. This project is running in Central America, so not in Europe. And the challenge that AB InBev was having is really related to water stewardship. So, as you can imagine, in some of these areas, they're at real risk now of low water levels and low watersheds, and so producers and food brands are intervening in big ways. So they're now looking at how they can drive land use change to improve soil structure and improve water retention in those sites. Now, the challenge is really that making those interventions is very expensive, and the wider impact of these nature-based solutions and their impact on biodiversity is unknown. So not only are these interventions expensive, there's a risk that actually, that they might have a negative impact on biodiversity as well. And the challenge was that in this particular project, the devices were up the side of an active volcano, so it's not a site that you can easily get access to. But clearly, we wanted to make sure that the data was there and helping to drive these critical business decisions. So what we were able to do was deploy devices in a range of different production systems, those which were being managed conventionally, and in the graph there, the ones that are in the sort of the lighter peach-coloured bars, and then those that were being managed following what they were classed as best practice. And best practice here is typically what we would consider kind of a regenerative farming system. So drawing a lot of inspiration from sort of ancient production practices. But what was really clear to see, irrespective of the cropping system, was actually that the kind of the best practice, or the regenerative practices, clearly showed a significant uplift in pollinator levels, which gave AB InBev the confidence that this information, these types of habitats, were worthwhile deploying, and that fundamentally was worth the investment across a broader area. And we're just looking now at kind of what comes next for that project and how we can help them to monitor the impact that these changes are having over the longer term as well.
There's a couple more questions here, but also if I can just reiterate my plea for people to fill out the polls, that would be great. If you've joined us a bit later in the piece, then if you just go back down to where the activities bar button is on the bottom right, then you can click in there. I know a couple of people have said they could be answering multiple for each one. Unfortunately, either the forms themselves or my ability to use them means that they're only single choice. But if you could just choose the most important one for you, that would be great. So there's a question here, Casey, around how we calculate the abundance figure and kind of where that figure comes from in the dashboard. And kind of the second part of that question is, how can you tell if it's one bee repeatedly or multiple bees making up that score?
Yeah. So it's great questions. So the way in which we calculate activity is primarily as a time metric. So if you imagine we've got a 10-second block, the system will look at things on a second-by-second basis. So if the sound of a bee has been detected in 1 second block out of the 10-second block, you'd have a score of 10%. So it's a percentage metric fundamentally. So time detected over the total time recorded. So that's kind of how the metric works, and we think that that's the most accurate way of presenting this data. You can use that information to make some estimates around the total number of bee visitations, but leading into your second question, it's very difficult to say it's one bee that's continually flying around the device versus 10 bees in an area. But given that the behavior of bees and pollinators tend to linger for too long in any given area, then we're usually confident that that's indicative of the broader population. But happy to answer any more technical questions like that when we've got more time.
Well, there's another question kind of maybe slightly linked to that around how the deployment of devices over an area and how we go about approaching that. So it might be useful to talk about how we think about habitats and then building up an understanding of what's happening in a given site.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, again, it's a really interesting question. I think it fundamentally depends on what we're trying to answer. So lots of our projects are looking at the relative importance of certain habitats. So as a rule of thumb, what we tend to say is let's deploy 3 units per habitat. And the reason we don't say just 1 unit is because we know that there is usually some variation in the quality of a habitat. So what we wouldn't want to do is put a unit into a patch of wildflowers, which isn't representative of the broader habitat. So we take that, we put the 3 units out and take an average. And that gives us enough information to then say, we can see that, this particular mix is better than this mix, or the water source is delivering better than the cropping area, or whatever the question might be. When we move towards what we call precision pollination, which is when we want to optimize pollinator abundance and activity to support particular productivity outcomes, then we would take a slightly different approach, and we would look at the cropping system, the environment type, and the way in which crops are being produced, to then work out a more bespoke deployment plan, and that's usually a higher density of units within an area, and we're looking at kind of distances between units to make sure we're mapping as much land as we can. But that tends to be for a much shorter window than, say, continuous monitoring. So slightly different approaches there. But again, very happy to elaborate and talk about specific sites if of interest.
I think ultimately it's always a bespoke approach depending on the nature of the site. I think that gives some good overview. And there's a question that's come in asking if there needs to be some kind of lure used to attract pollinators around the devices. But I think the kind of easy answer to that is no. And the real focus is the fact that we're constantly recording for a long period of time, means that we're able to then build up that picture of what's happening in that environment, as opposed to only being there for a short period of time and having to rely on any other techniques to try and be able to get the pollinators near the devices. And that, yeah, there's another question there, but I don't think we've kind of already answered that one. I guess one that I'll chuck in, Casey, is just a question that we get asked quite a lot from new customers: is how do I know that my numbers are good compared to someone else's?
Oh no, exactly. And I think when we come, it's very difficult to know. Every site is different, and every site will have plants which are producing different levels of pollen and nectar availability. There'll be natural variances in the number of pollinators in that area. So it's very difficult to say this site is good, this site is bad. Now, I think as we are collecting more data, we instinctively are starting to understand what we think good looks like, and we can start to draw comparisons from other projects. But fundamentally, in many ways, it doesn't matter what good looks like, in the sense that what we're trying to do a lot of the time is make comparisons between areas. So we know that if that land has got the ability to have areas where you've got 5% pollinator activity, and you've got areas which are only at 0.5% activity, we know that there's capacity for that population to grow, and those habitats to support greater areas or greater pollinator population. So we would be looking at kind of how we can move, how we can improve that to kind of what we're seeing on the sites. So it's a good question. I think it comes back down to the kind of people's willingness to share data as well. And one of the things we touched upon earlier is, how sensitive would you be for sharing this data? Obviously, it's not commercial in the sense that we're not making fundamental commercial decisions off of it, but it does have some value. So we are keen to understand, would people be interested in sharing all of their data, so we can start to understand that this is what the representative range of lavender as a habitat type is, and this is what oilseed rape looks like, and so that's some of the work that's ongoing. But no, we're working very hard on that for a number of different habitat types.
And that's why I think we're keen to make it clear there is an opportunity for organisations that maybe have a smaller amount of land or a smaller number of sites to participate in a more communal project of trying to build up that project 1 million, and then the more devices that are out there, the more we can develop the insights around various different benchmarks. We've got a question here about installation. I don't know if Callum's still there and you want to take this one. But the question is kind of who installs the units, how are they located, and what does that mean in terms of data integrity?
Yeah, so a really important thing for us that we've learned over the last few years is the fact that we have to really be on a collaborative approach with people, understanding what your site's like and how we're going to put these devices out there. So generally, you will install the devices. They're very simple to install. No tools are really needed, just your mobile phone with a network to register it. We walk you through the whole process and make sure that we're all on the same understanding of how it's going to be set up. And I'll make myself available, or someone else will make themselves available to answer any questions, or FaceTime or WhatsApp call on that day. But the important thing is, once you're putting the devices in, we will be making sure that everything's registered correctly, communicating with you quite soon after the install to make sure that you're happy with everything, so that we're not losing time on bad data groups or anything like that. So yeah, it's very simple to install. I think one unit would probably take you about 2 minutes once it's all unpackaged.
And the other key point is that there's tags on each device that then give us kind of key insights. That means we can then slice and dice the data accordingly. And so that process is really key when you kick it off. But then once it's done, the devices then work autonomously for the duration of the monitoring period.
Yeah. So we've tried to make that process in itself even more seamless. So the first time you enter something bespoke to your project, that will then get added to your organization's library of tags. So the next person going out, whether they're on the same farm or on the other side of the country, will see that you have used that naming convention. So that makes it a lot more effective for installs. The communication pieces sort of being resolved within that process.
Great. We've got one final case study. Casey, you're on mute. Had to happen at some stage.
Exactly. So I've touched upon this already throughout the webinar, but one of the areas which we're really interested in is what we call precision pollination. So how can we target areas of suboptimal pollinator activity and help farmers take actions to correct that deficit, and in theory that should lead to increased crop yield and crop quality. So we've just finished a really significant piece of work with NIAB. For those of you again outside the UK who are not familiar with NIAB, that's the UK's National Institute for Agricultural Botany. It's one of the UK's research organisations in this space. And so what we wanted to understand was, how does this product perform against manual observation? So can it give comparable results to the current gold standard? And then secondly, can we use this information generated from these devices to identify those deficit areas and then take corrective measures as well? So what we were able to do was show that areas with lower Bs, as detected by the devices, did have a lower yield. And then similarly, we was also then able to do some laboratory tests on the fruit arising from those, and we were able to show differences in the quality of those fruits as well, both in terms of micronutrient contents, but also eating quality as well. So there's lots and lots that we could talk about on this project. And for those of you which are particularly interested in precision pollination as a concept, do reach out to us separately. We will be running a separate session on this, just given that there is quite a lot of data that we can unpack, which we sadly won't have time for today. But do reach out to us and let us know, and we'll be happy to connect you with our pollination expert and present some of the latest findings in this exciting area.
Thanks, Casey. We've got there's a few questions that come in about research collaborations and what areas that we're currently working in. That Casey might just be able to talk a little bit about some of the interesting grants we've got going on. And there's contact details there if anyone wants to participate in a research collaboration or has ideas of different things we could do with the technology that we have. Then please get in touch there, and we'll get back to you.
Yeah, so again, I think there's lots we could unpack in that question. We have a number of grant-funded projects underway at the moment. We're looking at things like understanding the broader soundscape. So rather than looking at trying to monitor specific sounds of interest, we're looking at the entire sound landscape, or the soundscape, and trying to understand the diversity of sounds that are present within that as a different marker of biodiversity and inclusive of human activity within that. We have a number of projects looking at detecting different types of insects. We have a project looking at mason bees, in particular with some partners in Switzerland. We have projects looking at how this data could be coupled with other nature-based solutions as a way of quantifying the benefits around carbon insetting, and we're doing that in partnership with Cranswick, one of the UK's largest pig producers, and Hutchinson's, a large agronomy outfit here in the UK. We've done projects looking at particular pest monitoring as well. So we have some work looking at monitoring some moths of sugarcane in South Africa, as well as looking at some other pest moth species from a top fruit production perspective as well. So just a snippet of things that we're working on, but lots of great stuff. We also have a number of PhD collaborations as well, with Imperial and soon to have one with Aberdeen, both in pollinator monitoring linked to fruit production. So we very happy to collaborate with organisations, both public sector and private sector, and yeah, we're very R&D active ourselves. So like I say, if people have got interesting ideas, please do come and talk to us. We've certainly got lots of challenges that we're experiencing in terms of feedback, where different technologies and different solutions could play a vital role as well. So happy to share some of our learnings to that extent.
And that pretty much takes us to time. So thank you, Casey and Callum. Thank you everyone for listening. Thank you for the questions. Thank you to some of you, most of you, for filling out the polls. And we'll follow up with recording a summary and the insights on the data we've collected today in the next 24 hours.
Thank you very much. Cheers, guys. Have a good day.